Hi guys, so I was given session 7 and session 8 of the Open University resource. Really interesting. So I'm going to talk about session 7 first, which is about actually generally about coach developing. So broken down into about 10 areas and a little quiz at the end. I'm sure it's similar to everyone else's modules there, but just a few points that I've taken away from it, guys. So in terms of actually observing those coaches, so when we're actually on the level 3 and we're observing coaches and supporting and mentoring, observations not just of the coach but perhaps should be actually on the boxers as well. So instead of just observing the coach, what they say, what they do, the mannerisms, behaviours, etc., actually measuring the impact it actually has on the boxers. For example, Mick will go around and actually ask boxers, what's the theme, rather than actually just clipboarding the coach. So that gives us a lot of understanding about the actual effectiveness of what's happening. It could be that we're looking at the coach, but actually, if we're not looking at the boxers, then we miss a lot of information about transference of those skills and how effective the task is. I also looked at a video of an old school snooker coach, very autocratic coach, who was very much was all about the lady who was being coached being a sort of recipient of his information rather than a participant of the information. She never spoke once in the whole 10 minutes, maybe just the odd one, sort of yes or no with closed questions. Made me sort of reflect on my percentages of how often I talk and how often I'm wanting to be sort of sage on the stage when I'm coaching, rather than actually passing over the learning to them, being a bit more succinct and letting them actually get on with what they should be doing, rather than talking and over emphasising points and not letting them have time to actually go away and practice and develop. So that's one thing I'm taking away from that. I think that's a bit of a problem in boxing coaching in general. I think we all do talk too much. So also we talked about using checklists to monitor coaching. So does this actually take away from observational skills? If you're sort of sat there with a checklist all the time, is your head actually buried in that checklist, and are you missing the relevant information? But it does also allow you to address certain areas that need to be assessed even, especially if there is a criteria that they've got to meet, like we did with the level 3s. There was a criteria to meet, but I did find my head sort of buried in there sometimes. But it's about, can you get that qualitative and quantitative stuff down, or should it just be left in your head to forget? So it's almost like that kind of a hot versus cold review in your head. So there needs to be some sort of structure, I thought, but without going over structured, so you're missing the vital information. Talked about the 80-20 rule in terms of body language. So where 80 of what you say is non-verbal and 20 is verbal. Do our mannerisms match what we actually say? So does it reinforce or degrade the message and intent? So something we've got to be very, very aware of. And I suppose if we're all in the same room, let's say 3 of us are actually in the session in the same room at the same time, give a second guys, then are we all talk? Is one person delivering and we're all talking and on our phones and stuff like that, and it's just going to degrade the message. So as a collective coaching team, our body language needs to be very aware of that, I think, and that's something I took from there, definitely. So next one was planning observations. Always talked about relationships first. So hold on a second, guys. Keep the noise down a second, will you? There we go. Problems with the job. So maintain that relationship, so developing the relationship first, especially when we're doing the mentoring part. If they're not trusting us, they don't buy into us as a person, then what we say could be stuff that's going to make them levitate and float. But if they don't buy into us and we don't spend that time getting to know them a little bit on a personal level, then it's all become irrelevant. So it's basically sand under the house rather than cement. So also do it try and do it in their usual environment. So if we are observing, go to their gym. Do it in a safe user environment. Obviously, a lot of people really sort of folded a little bit when they went to GB the other day, and you get to understand that because it's quite intimidating. But can you do that in a comfortable environment? So we're seeing the real them. Also, align them with what the coach's objectives are, not just your subjective view. So when we are actually observing, to find out what their actually goals are for the session, rather than us just going, right, this is what I feel coaching should be, but we actually really missed the point. Their objectives might be along a certain line, so we need to be aware of what those are so we can give objective feedback, so it can be really sort of tailor-made for their intentions. asking what is the change in the boxes you're looking to see. So I think that's a good poignant question. So again, it just gets them to refer to or reflect on whether what they're doing is actually transferring and feeding into the goal that they're actually trying to achieve. So this will kind of gauge that co-creation approach to understanding the goals are actually reached, and how the coach developer can observe before feeding back to the coach. So that was, I thought, quite an important part. Logistics for the coach developer, like having the participants' names ready if you are having a checklist. So actually, maybe let's say there's 5 boxes, 6 boxes, actually having their names. So when we are actually feeding back to the coach, you can say, well, when you spoke to John, when you spoke to Claire, whoever it might be, then you're not missing vital information there, and it's not being confused. So you're kind of aligning your feedback with what actually did happen. Feeding back to the coach, where, when, straight after. So it can be, if you do it as a bit of a hot review straight after the information is very fresh, it can be a good way of doing it, but it also can be better if you kind of let the dust settle and maybe do it a little bit later. So it all depends. So you get different types of information when you're doing hot reviews and when you're doing colder reviews later. There might be more time for reflection, but I think it's important maybe to sample both parts there, get a hot review for them, and also do one which is at different times, just to see how the coach is actually reflecting in the moment and a lot later when they are reflecting. So it gives you a bit of an idea about their reflection skills. Little things like praise sandwich. There was a video there, the guy used a bit of a praise sandwich approach. I'm not a big fan of the praise sandwich, or the shit sandwich as they call it. Don't think it works. It's almost like, here's a load of fluff and rubbish, and then I'm going to hit you with actually what you've done wrong, and then I put a bit more fluff and rubbish, and I just don't think it builds trust. So it's I think it's one thing we've got to steer clear of a little bit, is doing that, because it takes away that sort of genuine approach and that sincerity. So we need to be very sincere. I think boxing coaches in general do like straight talking. They don't like you faffing around and wasting their time. So it's got to be like, this is what I saw, but putting it in a constructive way rather than a faffy way like a praise sandwich. So what did you hear? What was the reason for this? That kind of stuff. Putting the learning back on them by asking good open-ended questions rather than closed. So recounting the session to show that you were engaged as well. So this is what I saw. This is what I saw in your session. Shows real good active participation in the observation. So the coaches buy in, and any lack of clarity is engaged, and we can address that. You can have some leading questions. How did you check for understanding, rather than did you check for understanding? So if you're saying things like that, did you check for understanding, you're basically saying you didn't check for understanding, mate. But if you're saying how did you check for understanding, it gives them a bit of a reflection and makes them actually think, and there's a thinking process going on where they can actually lead them to, well, we didn't, okay, so how are we going to do that in the future? So it's a little bit more open-ended, puts them on a journey rather than being a little bit too fine, I think. The other stuff, if you sort of look at the science as well, if you are being quite aggressive with your feedback and quite negative all the time, then that limbic system, that part of the brain, all sort of shuts down, and the information that you talk is basically not going in. It's a bit like shouting at a boxer anyway. So if you're shouting at them, that information's not going to go in. So that frontal cortex part, prefrontal cortex, I believe, is not doing its job in trying to order the information that they're getting in. It's just being denied basically by the limbic system, and everything kind of shuts down. So I think that's important too, of maintaining that relationship. Co-creating the goals is also for the future is also really important. So kind of making them feel like they come up with the answer. If you're saying, right, so your goals for the future, next time I see you must be X, Y, Z, how much buy-in are they going to have with that? And again, it's similar to coaching your own boxers. How much buy-in will they really have? They must feel like they come up with the answers. So you're leading them with very much open-ended questions. It's almost quite motivational speaking type thing. Or motivational interviewing, should I say. Right, peer-to-peer observations was another part. So creating a culture of actually peer-to-peer feeding back, observing, evaluating the fellow coaches. Great thing that came out from me is it must be voluntary. So if you're going to create peer feedback between the coaches, these 16 coaches or 18 coaches that are on the course, we need to create kind of psychological safety with that. So it must be almost voluntary. I mean, obviously it's something that's going to be on the course and they need to do it, but it can't really be insisted upon. So if someone's not really engaging, it's our way to find out why they're not engaging, rather than tell them they must engage, because they must be buying. It must be voluntary, not insisted. So it's got to be very they have to buy in, rather than being oppressive or judgmental or kind of finite. Do talk a little bit about that in episode 27 and 32 of my podcast if you're interested, guys. So also looking at the autonomy support approach to learning, all getting better together with that progression in mind. I think it builds trust amongst us as the coach developers, and also amongst the coaches as well. So if we're all sharing practice all the time, which is exactly what we're doing right now, which is like I say, sorry I can't be there, but we're all sharing good practice and our experiences and what we learn, and that can only be a positive thing. And we've got to keep that culture alive and be very open and honest about what we're learning and how to share it and how we take it all on board. Okay, so nearly there with this one. So pulling it all together, so as a bit of a summary really, confirmation bias is an important thing to consider as well. What glasses you're actually, or lenses you're looking through when you are speaking to one of your coaches. Most coach developers are kind of ex-boxers, will probably, and need to be might have the need to be validated in what they're doing. So this is what I know, and I need my ego validated by telling you this is how I did it. This is what works for me. But we're missing the picture there. We're trying to get to the goal too much rather than really understanding that journey. Showing the correct way of guiding and exploring, not just so it's almost that guided exploration. Can you put them on a guided exploration? So even if you feel they're wrong, not saying no, that's wrong, but getting them to actually go and explore that and come back with how did it go, and that learning process will actually show them that perhaps they could have gone down a different path, but they may have been right in the first place. So it might have been that we were wrong and our biases kicked in. So going down that, I always find that I go down a guided discovery route, is trying to discover, because I know what the answer is, but I want to get that, which is fine. But sometimes I might be wrong, and it might be my biases. So going down that guided exploration route and letting them just go away and fail, and then come back can be a much more powerful thing to do. But we don't often do that. Is getting it right always a priority, or allow them to explore for understanding? That's kind of like a nice sentence they had typed in there, which kind of summarises what I just said. Is getting it right always a priority, or allow them to explore for understanding? So other thing, relationship is key. No power struggles at all. You've got to be professional and be as open and honest as possible, but not kind of forcing your views and opinions on them, letting them go on that journey. And also the old adage, observe and listen to understand rather than to respond, I think is an important skill to have, and we all fight with that. I always fight with that myself. Feedback should be a byproduct of the observations as opposed to what the goal was. Okay, so it could be, so we really may need to focus on what they're doing as opposed to why they're not at the goal yet. So just taking that kind of looking at the journey rather than the destination a bit more there. So it's very process learning. And always be structured about, but allow them to take the reins to an extent. So they might want to go off on a certain thing that they need to develop or feel they're passionate about developing. We can allow that to certain areas if we feel they're really off point. It might be a bit more guidance, but not being afraid to let them actually go after what they need to develop or feel they need to develop. So it's that really personal approach. So letting the coach do that rather than the coach developer being too dictatorial. Okay, so that is 7. I'll speak about 8 in a moment.